What happens when the person everyone ignores is secretly the most brilliant one in the room. For years, she was his beautiful, silent accessory, a living ornament he paraded at parties. Tonight was no different. At the most exclusive gala of the year, surrounded by billionaires and titans of industry, he laughed at her. He mocked her simple passions in front of everyone, cementing her role as the insignificant wife. But he made one fatal mistake. He did it in a room full of secrets, in front of a man who saw not what she was, but everything she could be. In one night, the spotlight would shift, a forgotten identity would be unleashed, and his entire world would be shattered by the woman he thought he owned. This is the story of how a public humiliation turned into the ultimate breathtaking triumph. The invitation was embossed on cardstock, so thick it felt like a wafer of ivory. Alistair Blackwood cordially requests the presence of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Sterling at the Starlight Gala. For Richard, this was a summons to his natural habitat, another arena to assert his dominance in the cutthroat world of tech private equity. For his wife Isabella, it was the annual ritual of being put on display. Richard Sterling was a man carved from ambition and arrogance. He had built his firm Sterling Ventures from the ground up, and he never let anyone, especially Isabella, forget it. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and Isabella, with her quiet grace and art history degree, had been a prime acquisition. She was beautiful, poised, and came from a respectable family, the perfect accessory to soften his sharp corporate edges. "Isabella, are you ready?" His voice boomed from the bottom of the grand curving staircase of their Manhattan penthouse. It wasn't a question, it was a command disguised as one. She took one last look in the full-length antique mirror. A woman stared back at her, draped in a deep sapphire gown that shimmered like a troubled sea. Diamonds. A 5th anniversary gift from Richard glittered coldly at her throat. She looked the part, Mrs. Sterling. But the woman inside, the one who used to spend hours lost in the Uffizi gallery, who could tell a Caravaggio from a Gentileschi by the play of shadow on a single fold of cloth, was a ghost in this reflection. "Wear the blue," he had instructed. "It matches the new Porsche." He hadn't looked at her when he said it, his eyes fixed on the stock market ticker scrolling across his phone. She descended the stairs, the silk of her dress whispering against the marble. Richard stood waiting impeccable in a Tom Ford tuxedo. He gave her a cursory glance, a swift appraisal that was more quality control than spousal admiration. "Good," he said, adjusting his bow tie. "Remember tonight, darling, we're sitting at Blackwood's table. That means less talk about your hobbies and more smiling. Can you do that for me?" Her hobbies were the remnants of her former life. She volunteered at a small museum downtown, helping with archival work, and spent her weekends visiting galleries, soaking in the art she could no longer professionally engage with. Richard called it her little charity project. He found it quaint, a harmless way for her to fill the hours between spa appointments and Pilates. "Of course, Richard," she replied, her voice smooth and practiced, betraying none of the familiar ache in her chest. The drive to Alistair Blackwood's estate on Long Island was a silent lecture. Richard detailed who would be there. Jack Carmichael, the shipping magnate, an old-money Vanderbilt heir, and most importantly, Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese tech billionaire. Richard was desperate to bring in on his next fund. "Tanaka is traditional," Richard explained, his eyes on the road. "He values a supportive wife. So when he speaks to you, keep it simple. The weather, the lovely party. Don't start on one of your art tangents. It bores people, Izzy." "My name is Isabella," she said, softly, more to herself than to him. He hadn't called her Isabella in years. It was always Izzy, a diminutive name for a diminutive role. As their car swept up the long, lamp-lit driveway, the Blackwood estate emerged from the darkness like a sleeping giant. It was a palace of granite and glass, a monument to new money, so vast it dwarfed the old. Valets in crisp uniforms scurried to open doors. The air buzzed with the low thrum of expensive cars, muffled laughter, and the distant pulse of a string quartet. Richard stepped out immediately, clapping a hand on the shoulder of a senator. He was instantly in his element, a shark in a tank of other sharks. Isabella followed a beautiful ship in his wake. She clutched her small beaded handbag, her knuckles white. She felt a familiar wave of invisibility wash over her. Here she was not Isabella Rossi, the scholar who graduated summa cum laude with a thesis on pigment degradation in Renaissance frescoes. She was just Richard Sterling's wife, a lovely, silent placeholder. He turned back to her for a moment, his smile a tight, practiced thing for the cameras. "All right, darling. Showtime. Just follow my lead, and for God's sake, try not to look so terrified. You're my wife, not a hostage." He chuckled at his own joke, a harsh, grating sound. But as she stepped into the blinding light of the grand ballroom, past the towering ice sculptures and the cascades of white orchids, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was, in fact, both. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate was a breathtaking spectacle of calculated excess. Chandeliers dripping with crystals like frozen waterfalls cast a fractured golden light over the 300 guests. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, a heady cocktail mixed with the low hum of powerful conversations, where fortunes were made and reputations were broken between sips of vintage champagne. Richard navigated the room with predatory ease, pulling Isabella along by the elbow. He introduced her with a possessive flourish. "This is my wife, Isabella." He never added more, as if her name and her connection to him were the only relevant facts. The men would shake her hand, their eyes gliding over her before returning to Richard, the true center of gravity. The women would offer air kisses and compliments on her dress, their gazes sharp and assessing, cataloguing her worth in carats and couture. They finally reached their designated place of honor, Alistair Blackwood's table. Blackwood himself was a formidable presence, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and the unnervingly still eyes of a hawk. He greeted Richard with a firm handshake, and Isabella with a polite, dismissive nod. The guest of honor, Kenji Tanaka, sat to Blackwood's right, a slight older man with an inscrutable expression. The conversation was a verbal chess match. They spoke of market caps, geopolitical risks, and emerging technologies. Isabella sat in perfect practiced silence, a serene smile fixed on her face. She took small sips of water, her mind drifting to a small, dusty painting she had seen in a gallery that morning. A landscape with clouds so perfectly rendered they felt heavy with rain. It was during a lull in the financial talk that Alistair Blackwood, in an attempt at broader social grace, turned his attention to her. "And Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Richard tells me you're a patron of the arts, a noble pursuit." Before Isabella could form a reply, Richard laughed. It wasn't a warm, inclusive laugh. It was a sharp, dismissive bark that drew the attention of the entire table. "Oh, Alistair, you're too kind," Richard said, waving a hand. "She keeps herself busy, our Izzy does. Spends her days hunting for dusty old things in museums. I keep telling her she should be hunting for bargains on Madison Avenue it would yield a better return on investment. A few people at the table offered polite, sycophantic chuckles. Kenji Tanaka's face remained impassive. Isabella felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. It was one thing to be dismissed in private, but to have her passion so casually mocked in front of these people was a fresh kind of cruelty. He had reduced her life's love to a frivolous shopping habit. He wasn't done. Just last week she came home all excited about what was it, darling? Some cracked paint on a portrait of a fat Dutch merchant. He looked at her, his eyes gleaming with condescending amusement, expecting her to play along, to be the butt of his charming joke. Tell them. It was quite the story. The spotlight was on her. 10 pairs of powerful eyes were fixed on her, waiting. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the sapphire folds of her dress. But then she caught her own reflection in the polished silver of a water pitcher. She saw the woman in the diamond necklace, the silent accessory, and for the first time in a long time, a spark of rebellion flickered within her. She lifted her chin, her practiced smile melting away to be replaced by something cooler, more composed. It was a study of craquelure, Richard, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the low hum of the room. The specific web-like pattern of cracking in the paint's gesso layer. This particular pattern suggested it was of the 17th century Dutch school, but the brushwork in the lace collar was inconsistent with the techniques of the supposed artist. It was likely a forgery. Silence. The explanation was too technical, too precise. Richard's smile faltered. He had expected a flustered, giggling response, not a miniature lecture. He tried to recover, to reclaim the joke. See? What did I tell you, a regular art detective? He laughed again, louder this time, but it sounded forced. Frankly, I wouldn't know a Rembrandt from a Rorschach test. I leave the pretty pictures to my wife. He leaned over and patted her hand in a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt brutally patronizing. That's why she's here, to look pretty. The humiliation was complete. He had not only belittled her intelligence, but reduced her entire existence to her appearance. The polite chuckles died, replaced by a slightly uncomfortable silence. Alistair Blackwood raised an eyebrow, and Kenji Tanaka took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, his dark eyes resting on Isabella for just a moment longer than necessary. It was in that moment of crushing silence that a new voice entered the conversation, smooth as velvet and accented with the melodic cadence of northern Italy. On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, the voice said, a discerning eye that can spot a forgery is infinitely more valuable than one that can only spot a price tag. All heads turned. Standing just behind the table was a man who had not been there moments before. He was tall and lean, with silver threading his dark hair at the temples. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal grey, no tie, with an air of effortless European elegance. His eyes, a shade of warm, intelligent brown, were fixed directly on Isabella. Richard, flustered by the interruption, blustered, "And you are—" The man's lips curved into a subtle smile, but his eyes never left Isabella's. "My name is Matteo Bellini," he said, "and I found Mrs. Sterling's observation fascinating." The name Matteo Bellini fell onto the table with a tangible weight. Alistair Blackwood, who had been leaning back in his chair with an air of bored amusement, sat up straighter. Even Richard, whose knowledge of the art world was performatively shallow, recognized the name. Bellini wasn't just some guest. He was a titan in a different kind of jungle. His family owned one of the most prestigious art authentication firms in the world, with offices in Milan, London, and New York. They were the silent arbiters of artistic fortunes, the whisperers who could turn a canvas in an attic into a national treasure or expose a masterpiece as a multi-million-dollar fraud. "Matteo, I didn't realize you had arrived." Blackwood boomed, his tone shifting from polite host to respectful peer. "Come join us. We were just admiring the decor." Matteo's gaze remained on Isabella, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He had heard Richard's jibe, and his intervention was a deliberate act. He pulled up a chair, placing it beside Isabella, a subtle but significant act of alignment. "My apologies for the intrusion," Matteo said to the table, though his words were clearly for her. "But it is rare to overhear a discussion of craquelure at a financial gala, especially one so precise." Richard, trying to regain control, forced a laugh. "Well, that's my Izzy. Full of useless, fascinating facts." He placed a proprietary hand on Isabella's shoulder. She flinched almost imperceptibly. Matteo noticed. His eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. He ignored Richard entirely and spoke directly to Isabella, his voice a low, respectful murmur that created an intimate bubble around the two of them. "You said the brushwork was inconsistent. In what way, for the first time all evening, someone was asking her a genuine question, not about the charity committee she sat on, not about her decorator, but about something she knew, something she loved. A long dormant part of her flickered to life." "The rough," she began, her voice gaining confidence. The artist Richard was referring to Van Hoogstraten used a specific technique for lace building up the white pigment in thick, almost sculptural layers to catch the light. The portrait I saw used thin, blended glazes. It was technically proficient, but it was a copyist's technique. It mimicked the form, but not the substance. As she spoke, the table fell silent. This was not the rambling of a hobbyist. This was the sharp, analytical language of an expert. Kenji Tanaka leaned forward slightly, his impassive mask cracking with a flicker of genuine interest. Matteo nodded slowly, his expression one of deep concentration. "A dead stroke," he murmured, using the industry term for a brush stroke that lacks the life and intent of the original artist. "Precisely. Most forgers are caught not by what they paint, but by how they paint it. Their hands betray them." He turned his full attention to her, and she felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. It was as if he had wiped away the glossy veneer of Mrs. Sterling and was speaking directly to Isabella Rossi. "You have a remarkable eye, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his tone devoid of flattery, stating it as a simple fact. "Isabella," she corrected him quietly. "Please call me Isabella." "Isabella." He repeated the name, sounding different in his mouth, fuller, more complete. Richard shifted uncomfortably. This was not part of his script. The conversation had veered into a territory where he was not the expert, where he was, in fact, an ignorant bystander. His wife, his beautiful quiet accessory, was holding court with Matteo Bellini, and he was being utterly ignored. Alistair Blackwood, ever the opportunist, saw a new angle to the evening. "Well, if we have an expert in our midst, perhaps she can settle a little debate for me." He gestured across the vast ballroom to a quieter, wood-paneled alcove where a collection of smaller paintings was displayed. "I acquired a piece recently," Blackwood explained. "A small Italian panel, supposedly from the studio of Artemisia Gentileschi. My own curators are divided. Some say it has her fire, others say it's a clever imitation by one of her followers. I've been meaning to send it to a firm for analysis." He looked pointedly at Matteo, then his gaze slid to Isabella. "But perhaps we could have a preliminary opinion." It was a test, a piece of social theatre for his powerful guests. Richard immediately saw it as a trap. "Oh, Alistair, I don't think—" he started, wanting to shut it down to pull Isabella back into her box before she could embarrass herself and, by extension, him. But Matteo interrupted smoothly, standing up and extending a hand, not to Richard, but to Isabella. "I would be honored to accompany an expert to view the piece," he said, his eyes challenging her. "If she is willing." The entire table was watching her. Richard's face was a thundercloud of warning. He wanted her to refuse to laugh it off, to shrink back into her designated role. It was the safe thing to do. But the sting of his public mockery was still fresh. The warmth of Matteo's intellectual respect was a heady, forgotten tonic. She looked at Richard's furious face, then at Matteo's waiting hand. For a decade she had followed her husband's lead. Tonight she chose a different path. "I would be happy to look at it," Isabella said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. She placed her hand in Matteo's, stood up, and let him lead her away from the table, leaving her husband sitting there silenced and utterly bewildered. The alcove was an oasis of quiet in the roaring sea of the party. The air was cooler here, smelling of old wood and beeswax. The paintings were lit with a soft, focused light, each a small world unto itself. Alistair Blackwood, Matteo, and a curious Kenji Tanaka followed Isabella, while Richard trailed behind, his posture stiff with indignation. A small crowd of intrigued onlookers began to drift in their direction, sensing a shift in the evening's entertainment. Blackwood gestured to a small, dark painting on the wall. It depicted the biblical scene of Judith beheading Holofernes, a subject favored by Artemisia Gentileschi. The painting was dramatic, full of visceral emotion, but it was muted, as if seen through a veil of grime and aged varnish. "This is it," Blackwood announced. "My people say the canvas and stretcher are period-correct, 17th century Bologna. The pigments are inconclusive without a full chemical analysis. The provenance is murky lost after the Napoleonic Wars, until it resurfaced at a minor auction in Lyon." Isabella stepped forward, her earlier nervousness replaced by a deep, focused calm. This was her world. She was no longer a guest at a party. She was a scholar in front of a puzzle. She leaned in her eyes, scanning the surface with an intensity that made everything else in the room fade away. She didn't see the crowd gathering behind her. She didn't see Richard's scowling face or Matteo's encouraging gaze. She saw only the paint. She spent a full 2 minutes in complete silence. Her head tilted her eyes, tracing the flow of the brushstrokes, the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the chiaroscuro that was a hallmark of the Caravaggisti painters, like Gentileschi. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to a small, powerful penlight that one of Blackwood's security guards held. He handed it to her without question. She angled the light across the surface of the painting, a technique called raking light, which reveals the topography of the paint, the texture, the impasto. The onlookers murmured, impressed by her professionalism. Richard just crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "What do you see, Isabella?" Matteo asked softly, his voice a low anchor in the charged silence. Isabella took a deep breath. "I see a problem," she said, her voice resonating with authority. She pointed the beam of light at the face of Judith's maidservant, who was partially obscured in shadow. "Gentileschi was a master of depicting fabric," she explained, her voice clear and didactic, as if she were lecturing to a class of graduate students. The folds of a sleeve, the weight of a velvet cloak, she gave them life texture. "Look here." She traced the light over the maidservant's sleeve. "The folds are hesitant. They're technically correct, but they lack conviction. They describe the shape of an arm, but they don't convey the tension of the muscle beneath. It's a copyist's work, someone painting from a drawing, not from life. A whisper went through the small crowd. Blackwood's own curator, a man named Peterson, who had joined the group, nodded grimly. This was the argument he had made. Richard saw an opportunity to end this, to bring her back to heel. "So it's a fake," he said loudly with an air of finality. "A good one, but a fake. Mystery solved. Shall we get back to the champagne?" "I didn't say it was a fake," Isabella countered without looking at him. Her focus was absolute. "I said the maidservant was painted by a different hand." She moved the light to the main figure, Judith. The woman's face was a mask of grim determination, her arms taut with the effort of her grisly task. "But this is different." Her voice dropped, filled with a sudden, breathless awe. "Look at the tension in the knuckles, the way the light catches the blood. It's not just red paint, it's rendered with a transparency that makes it look wet, viscous. And the foreshortening on Holofernes' arm, it's audacious, almost violent in its execution." She turned off the penlight and faced Alistair Blackwood directly. "Mr. Blackwood, your curators are both right and wrong. This isn't a work by Gentileschi's studio. It's a work that was altered in Gentileschi's studio." The room was utterly still. "What are you talking about?" Blackwood demanded, his voice sharp. "This was a common practice," Isabella explained, her confidence soaring. "A master painter would have students work on less important elements, backgrounds, secondary figures to learn the craft. But the master would always paint the critical parts. The maidservant was likely painted by an apprentice, but the figures of Judith and Holofernes, the emotion, the raw power, the sheer anatomical confidence, they were painted by the master herself." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This isn't a studio copy. This is a genuine autograph work by Artemisia Gentileschi, a lost original. The student's work was likely a later addition, perhaps to finish the painting for a quick sale after the master had moved on. Over the centuries, the grime and yellowed varnish have obscured the difference in quality, making it all look like the work of one lesser artist." Peterson, the curator, stepped forward, his eyes wide. "My God," he whispered. "The pentimento." We saw a faint pentimento under the X-ray around Judith's arm, a change in the composition. We thought it was just the artist changing their mind. "It's the master correcting the student's positioning," Isabella stated simply. She painted over it. It's her signature, more real than any name in the corner. The spotlight had now fully irrevocably shifted. It was no longer on Richard Sterling, the titan of finance, or Alistair Blackwood, the powerful host. It was on Isabella, the quiet wife, who stood before a dusty old painting and unveiled a forgotten masterpiece hidden in plain sight. Richard stared, his mouth slightly agape. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had reduced to a pretty object, was commanding the attention and respect of everyone in the room, with an intellect and passion he had never bothered to acknowledge, let alone understand. The laughter had died in his throat, replaced by the cold, sickening dread of a man who has just realized the true value of an asset he has catastrophically misunderstood. The silence in the alcove was broken by a single sharp sound. Kenji Tanaka began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate applause, a sign of profound respect. One by one, others joined in, not the polite, scattered applause of a party, but a genuine ovation. Alistair Blackwood stared at Isabella, his hawk-like eyes filled with a new avaricious light. He was not looking at his guest's wife. He was looking at a human asset more valuable than any stock in his portfolio. Peterson, Blackwood barked at his curator. Get this painting off the wall. I want it sent to the labs at the Met first thing in the morning. Full spectral analysis, X-ray the works, and I want Isabella to consult. It was a command, but also an offer. A job. Richard, snapping out of his stupor, tried to reclaim the narrative. He stepped forward, putting his arm around Isabella's shoulders, a gesture of proud ownership. That's my wife, he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too hearty. Always knew she had a good eye. Isabella stiffened under his touch and subtly stepped away, breaking the contact. The gesture was small, but in the charged atmosphere, it was a seismic event. She didn't look at him. Her attention was on the painting and the two men who understood its significance. Matteo Bellini had been watching the entire exchange with a quiet, knowing smile. He now approached Blackwood. Alistair, if Isabella's hypothesis is correct, and I have no doubt that this painting is not just a masterpiece, it's the missing Judith of Bologna. It was documented in a Medici inventory in 1638 and then vanished. The Bellini Institute has been searching for it for 2 generations. Its value is not in the millions. It's in the tens of millions. It's culturally priceless. Every jaw in the vicinity dropped. Richard's face went pale. He had mocked her interest in something that was worth more than his entire last fund. Matteo turned to Isabella, his eyes shining with professional admiration and something more, something deeper. Isabella. That was not just a good eye. That was genius. The kind of intuitive leap that scholars spend entire careers hoping to make once. My firm in New York is expanding. We are looking for a new head of Renaissance authentication. The position is yours if you would consider it. You would have your own lab, your own team, an expense account for travel to any collection in the world. You would simply have to do what you just did. A second job offer. In less than 10 minutes, she had gone from being an object of ridicule to one of the most sought-after experts in the room. The crowd around them was buzzing. People were no longer looking at Richard at all. They were looking at Isabella, whispering her name. Who was she? Where had Sterling been hiding her? The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. She was the sun, and he was a forgotten planet drifting in her orbit. Richard could feel the foundations of his world cracking. His identity was built on being the smartest, most powerful man in any room. But in this room, his wife had just eclipsed him entirely. His mockery of her now hung in the air, a testament not to his wit, but to his own staggering ignorance. He saw the looks on the faces of his peers, Carmichael the Vanderbilt heir, and worst of all, Kenji Tanaka. Tanaka was watching Isabella with an expression of profound respect, the very expression Richard had been trying to win all night. He tried again, his voice strained. Darling, that's an incredible offer. We should discuss it. The we was a desperate attempt to include himself in her triumph. Isabella finally turned to look at him. For the first time, she saw him not through the haze of years of intimidation and belittlement, but with the cold, clear eyes of an authenticator. She saw a man whose confidence was a forgery, whose power was built on diminishing others. She saw his fear, his desperation, and she felt nothing. The ache in her chest, the one that had been her constant companion for a decade, was gone. There is nothing to discuss, Richard, she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying the finality of a gavel strike. She then turned back to Matteo and Alistair Blackwood, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time that night. "Gentlemen," she said, "I believe you both have my contact information. I would be delighted to speak with you further. Next week." With that, she turned and walked away from the alcove, not back towards their table, but towards the grand terrace overlooking the gardens. She moved with a newfound grace, her spine straight, her head held high. The crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. Richard Sterling was left standing in her wake, his hand, which had been reaching for her, frozen in mid-air. He was alone in the spotlight she had left behind, and it felt harsh and cold and utterly unforgiving. The laughter of the party seemed to mock him, each burst of merriment, a fresh echo of his own colossal, world-shattering mistake. The rest of the gala was a torturous blur for Richard. He tried to mingle, to re-engage in conversations about finance and acquisitions, but the energy had shifted. People's eyes would flicker from him to the terrace, where Isabella was now holding court with a captivated circle that included Matteo Kenji Tanaka and a curator from the Getty, who had materialized from the crowd. When people did speak to Richard, the question was always the same, tinged with a new and galling respect for his wife. "Your wife is extraordinary, Richard. How did you two meet?" He would mumble something about a university function, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was no longer Richard Sterling, the master of the universe. He was Isabella's husband, a footnote in her sudden, brilliant ascent. He felt a primal, possessive rage building within him. How dare she? How dare she do this to him in front of these people? It was a betrayal, a public emasculation. He had given her everything, the penthouse, the diamonds, the life of effortless luxury, and she had repaid him by making him a fool. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he found her and hissed, "We're leaving." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't protest. She simply excused herself with a calm, regal grace and walked with him to the exit. The goodbyes were a stark contrast to their arrival. Alistair Blackwood shook Richard's hand perfunctorily before taking Isabella's in both of his. "A truly memorable evening, Isabella. My office will call yours." The use of yours as a separate entity was not lost on Richard. The ride home in the back of the chauffeured Maybach was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. The glittering lights of Long Island blurred past the tinted windows. Richard stared straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. Isabella looked out her own window, her reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the dark, rushing landscape. He had to say something to regain control to fix this. He decided on magnanimity. "I have to admit, Izzy," he began, trying to make his voice sound casual proud. "That was quite a performance back there. You really had them going." Isabella turned her head slowly to look at him. "It wasn't a performance, Richard." Right, of course." He backpedaled. "What I mean is I'm proud of you. I had no idea you had that in you. You should have told me you were that good." The accusation was subtle but clear. "You hid this from me." A small, humorless smile touched her lips. "Told you?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. "I have tried to tell you for 10 years. Every time I mentioned my research, you called it a hobby. Every time I tried to share a discovery from the museum, your eyes glazed over. You didn't want to know, Richard. You wanted me to be a beautiful empty room for you to decorate." The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He flinched. "That's not fair. I supported your interests. I paid for everything. The charity donations, the museum galas." "You paid for my silence?" she cut in, her voice gaining an edge of steel he had never heard before. "You funded my cage at all. You didn't support my passion. You tolerated it because it kept me occupied and out of your way. Tonight you didn't just dismiss my hobby, Richard. You held up the very core of who I am, to be mocked by your friends. You laughed at me. It was a joke, a simple party joke, he protested, his voice rising. No, she said, her gaze unwavering. A joke is something two people laugh at. You were laughing at me, and they were laughing with you. You used me to make yourself feel clever and charming, just like you've always done. The car swept onto the Queensboro Bridge, the iconic skyline of Manhattan rising before them, a city of towers Richard had once felt he owned. Now it felt alien and hostile. So what now? He demanded, his desperation turning to anger. You're going to go work for this Italian suit. Throw away everything we've built. Isabella looked at him, and he saw the vast, barren distance that had grown between them. It wasn't just a rift. It was a canyon. What did we build, Richard? She asked, her voice filled with a decade of quiet sorrow. You built an empire. I built a life of quiet resignation within it. You talk about it like a partnership, but I was never a partner. I was an acquisition, and I've just discovered my market value is significantly higher than you appraised it. The car pulled up to their gleaming residential tower. The doorman rushed to open the door, but neither of them moved. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. I forbid you to take that job, Richard said, his voice low and menacing. It was his last resort, the trump card of the patriarch. Isabella did something he had never seen her do. She laughed. It was not a sound of mirth. It was the sound of chains breaking. You forbid me, she said, turning to face him fully in the dim light of the car. Richard, you don't get it. The woman you could forbid from doing things ceased to exist tonight. She died on the floor of that ballroom right after you told a table of your friends that she was only there to look pretty. You are looking at a stranger now. She opened her own door, stepping out into the cool night air without a backward glance. He watched her walk into the building, her spine straight, her steps sure. He had entered the party as a king with his queen on his arm. He was leaving it a jester alone in the back of his gilded limousine, choking on the echoes of his own laughter. The penthouse, which had once been Richard's monument to his own success, became his gilded prison. For 3 agonizing days, he and Isabella coexisted in a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight, absorbing all sound and warmth. The vast, sun-drenched rooms felt cold, the polished marble floors like sheets of ice. He'd hear the quiet click of her shoes on the staircase, the soft rustle of her turning a page in the library, and each small sound was a reminder of the colossal, unbridgeable chasm that had opened between them. He tried to fix it the only way he knew how with money. On the first day, he had a flat velvet box from Harry Winston, delivered by special courier. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a diamond bracelet, a river of flawless stones, so brilliant it hurt to look at. He left it on the antique console table in the foyer, a silent, extravagant apology. It remained there untouched, its opulent sparkle, a mockery of his attempt. It was not a peace offering. It was just another expensive link for a chain she was no longer willing to wear. On the second day, he tried nostalgia. He secured a last-minute reservation at Per Se, the site of their first anniversary, a place of hushed reverence and astronomical prices. He left the confirmation note on her pillow. An hour later, an email from the maitre d' landed in his inbox. Dear Mr. Sterling, we are sorry to hear you will not be able to make your reservation. Mrs. Sterling cancelled it a few moments ago. He stared at the screen, the words blurring. She was not just rejecting his offerings. She was actively dismantling the framework of their shared life. He was losing. The realization was no longer a quiet dread, but a screaming panic in the back of his mind. This wasn't just a marital spat. This was an extinction-level event for his ego. He thought of the whispers that must already be slithering through the city's elite social circles. The story of the gala was too good, too dramatic to remain contained. He would be the punchline, the man who owned a treasure and called it a trinket. On the afternoon of the fourth day, he came home early, a desperate plan forming in his mind to whisk her away to their villa in Lake Como, to trap her with luxury and memory until she submitted. He found her in the master bedroom's vast walk-in closet, a space larger than most New York apartments. A sleek silver Rimowa suitcase lay open on the ottoman. She was folding a silk blouse with a calm, methodical precision that he found utterly terrifying. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The question was a formality. He knew exactly what she was doing. "I'm packing Richard," she said, not looking up. "I'm leaving." Leaving to wear a hotel. He stepped into the closet, the scent of her perfume, a fragrance he had chosen for her, suddenly feeling alien. "This is ridiculous, Izzy. This is our home. We can work this out. We can go to therapy. I'll hire the best in the city. I'll listen more. I swear to God I'll come to your dusty museum with you. Just don't do this." She finally paused, placing the folded blouse into the suitcase. She looked up at him, and her eyes were not filled with anger or sadness, but with a weary, clinical pity. "You're still not listening," she said softly. "You think this is a negotiation, a problem to be solved with a new strategy. You think you can fix us by allocating a few hours of your precious time to my interests, as if it were a portfolio you'd neglected. This isn't about you making a few cosmetic changes, Richard. This is about me remembering who I was before my name was Sterling." She closed one half of the suitcase and opened the other, beginning to arrange her shoes. "For 10 years I let your definition of me become my reality. The elegant wife, the gracious hostess, the quiet patron. It was a beautiful portrait, I suppose, but it was a forgery, and I was the one living inside it." She straightened up and walked past him out of the closet and into the bedroom. He followed her, a sense of powerlessness washing over him, a feeling so foreign it made him physically dizzy. "I spoke with Matteo Bellini this morning," she said, picking up her handbag from the chaise lounge. "I've accepted his offer. I'm moving to our guest apartment downtown for now. My new office will arrange for the rest of my things to be collected next week." She paused, then delivered the final blow. "My flight to Milan for my first assignment, a private collection with 2 potential Caravaggios, is on Friday." Milan. The word echoed in the cavernous room. "You can't—" He stammered the words, feeling weak and useless. "Your life is here. Everything you have is because of me." She turned to face him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You're right. Everything I have is because of you. The clothes, the jewelry, the address. But everything I am, I had that long before we met. And I'm going to get it back." She looked around the opulent room at the silk wallpaper and the priceless antiques. "My life was never here, Richard. My life was paused here. You didn't see me. But that night at the party, so many people saw me. And for the first time in a decade I saw me. And I want to get to know her again without the varnish." He reached for her arm, his last desperate attempt to physically restrain her to hold on to his possession. "I love you, Izzy." The words felt clumsy, ill-fitting in his own mouth, a currency he hadn't traded in for years. She didn't pull away. She simply looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Perhaps you did in your own way," she said, her voice softening, not with forgiveness, but with a final heart-breaking clarity. "You loved the idea of me. You loved the painting of a wife that you hung on your arm for all the world to see. But the real canvas underneath, the one with all the texture and the complex shadows and the hidden light, you never even bothered to look." She gently removed his hand from her arm. "Goodbye, Richard." And with that, she walked out of the bedroom. He listened to her footsteps recede down the long hall, the decisive click of the front door latch echoing through the silent penthouse. It was the sound of his world ending. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in social and professional humiliation. Kenji Tanaka's multi-billion-dollar family office formally withdrew their 9-figure investment from his new fund, the excuse a polite but transparent fiction about re-evaluating European market exposure. The true reason was whispered at the exclusive clubs he frequented. Tanaka did not invest with fools. Richard started getting disinvited to the intimate dinners and weekend retreats that were the true nexus of power in his world. He was still on the A-list for the big charity galas, but he was no longer at the head table. He had become a social liability. His world shrank to his office and the cavernous penthouse. He saw her name everywhere, now proudly Isabella Rossi. An article in Art Forum magazine featured a glowing profile of the Bellini Institute's brilliant new hire. There was a photo of her in a lab in Florence, smiling, pointing at something on a screen, her eyes alight with a fire he hadn't seen since they first met. She looked younger, happier, more vibrant than she ever had as Mrs. Sterling. 6 months after she left, he was served with divorce papers. His lawyer was ecstatic. "She's not coming after the company, the real estate, or your portfolio. It's the cleanest break I've ever seen." Isabella's request was simple. She wanted her maiden name restored and one single piece of marital property. It was a small, dark painting he had bought at a charity auction years ago at her insistence. A moody, atmospheric seascape by an unknown 19th century British artist. He had always hated it, finding it depressing, and it had been relegated to a storage unit in New Jersey for years. "Give it to her," Richard spat, signing the papers with a flourish. "Let her have her ugly painting. It's a small price to pay to be rid of her." He saw it as a final victory, proof of her sentimentality and poor judgment. 2 weeks later, he was at the bar of the pool nursing a scotch when a news report came on the large screen above the bar. A well-known anchor was speaking. "In the art world, it's being called the discovery of the decade." The screen cut to a press conference at the Met. And there she was, Isabella. She stood beside an easel that held the very same ugly seascape. It looked different now, cleaned and properly lit, the colors deeper, the storm-tossed waves seeming to churn with life. "Expert Isabella Rossi," the anchor was saying, "who acquired the painting in a recent divorce settlement, suspected it was more than it appeared. Using advanced infrared reflectography and pigment analysis, her team at the Bellini Institute uncovered a faint obscured signature in the lower right corner, hidden beneath a layer of later varnish. The camera zoomed in on the corner of the painting, showing a digital rendering of the signature J.M.W. Turner. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. Long thought to be a lost study for his Fishermen at Sea series. The anchor continued, her voice bright with excitement. The painting has been authenticated as a genuine, previously unknown work by the great British master. Christie's auction house has valued it conservatively at $40 million. He watched, paralyzed, as Isabella stepped to the microphone. She looked directly into the camera, poised and powerful. "Art shouldn't be hidden away," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It should be used to inspire. That is why, after the auction, the entirety of the proceeds will be used to establish the Rossi Endowment for Art Preservation and Education at the Hudson Museum of Art." The Hudson Museum, her little downtown charity project. The final shot of the news segment was of the museum's director weeping with joy, hugging Isabella. Richard was left staring at the screen at the ghost of his wife, a woman he had never known. He had laughed at her passion, dismissed her knowledge, and in his final arrogant act had freely given away a fortune. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost a world he was too blind to see. And she had taken that world and used it to build a legacy, leaving him with nothing but the deafening, echoing silence of his own colossal mistake. Isabella's story is a powerful reminder that our true value is never determined by how others see us, but by the courage it takes to see ourselves. For years she was trapped in a gilded cage, her brilliance dismissed and her passions mocked. But one night, one single moment of defiance changed everything. She didn't just reclaim her voice, she rebuilt her entire world on her own terms, with the very talents her husband had tried to bury. Her journey teaches us that the brightest lights are often hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to shine. If Isabella's journey from invisibility to triumph resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of rediscovering your own worth, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this story with someone who might need to be reminded of their own hidden genius. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story of justice empowerment and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.